This week on Cinematic Sound Radio.
Your brothers and friends shall be avenged.
Santa Anna took no prisoners, killing all who oppose him. He'll show no mercy.
This is war.
Today we are one. We give Texas our allegiance. We give Texas our lives. We march!
It was a place where a man could start over, where a fortune could be made. They say every town has a story. Tombstone has a legend.
Who is he?
That's Wyatt Earp.
Hanging around with you is no picnic.
We shine the spotlight on composer Bruce Broughton, who over the course of the past 30 years has defined the sound of the Hollywood Western. My name is Eric Woods, and I invite you to join me for the next 2 hours as I present for you the Bruce Broughton Westerns, right here on the film, TV, and video game music radio show Cinematic Sound, which begins now.
This is the Cinematic Sound Radio Spotlight.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Cinematic Sound Radio. The show can be heard in various different forms and locations. You can listen live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on WROCK Radio at WROCKradio.com. You can stream the show on demand at cinematicsound.net, download the show via iTunes, or listen to us at podtyrant.com. This is our first show in the past 2 weeks, and I apologize for the inconvenience of that, as I really needed last week off badly. Today we're featuring yet another In the Spotlight episode. I had to throw this one together really fast since I was going to be out of town during most of this week, so I rifled through my old archives and found a show that I produced back in January of 2006. This show is called Bruce Broughton Westerns. And the reason why I wanted to do this show today was mainly because of Silverado, the first score that we're going to play for you, which popped up on my iPod recently, which was a wonderful recording by Erich Kunzel and the Cincinnati Pops Orchestra. And I really wanted to play that score for you on the show today. So we're skipping the normal format, which will return next week, so you can enjoy 2 hours of Bruce Broughton goodness. Now, if you don't know who Bruce Broughton is, then this will be a perfect introduction to his work for you. I said this earlier in the intro that out of all active composers working today, no one has defined the sound of the Hollywood Western the way Bruce Broughton has in the past 30 years. Silverado was actually Bruce Broughton's first major film score, and it garnered him an Academy Award nomination back in 1985. And interestingly enough, Bruce Broughton actually cut his teeth in TV scoring for Westerns, for such shows as How the West Was Won and Gunsmoke. Now, after Silverado, his very next assignment was a classically styled score for Barry Levinson's Young Sherlock Holmes, which resulted in a Grammy nomination for the soundtrack album. Broughton has composed in a broad range of styles. He's written the scores for such major motion pictures as Lost in Space, Tombstone, Miracle on 34th Street, The Presidio, Narrow Margin, Harry and the Hendersons, The Boy Who Could Fly, The Rescuers Down Under, the two popular Homeward Bound adventures. He's also worked in comedy, Kippendorf's Tribe, Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, and he conducted and supervised the recording of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue for Fantasia 2000. He's received multiple Emmy Award nominations. He's won it a record 10 times. His television credits include the main themes for Jag, Tiny Toon Adventures, Quincy, He's also worked on The Blue and the Gray, and his score for Heart of Darkness was the first game to feature an orchestral score composed for the game. He's also an acclaimed concert composer, and he's been working on a new album with Seth MacFarlane. So up first today, we're going to listen to that first major film score of Bruce Broughton's, that being Silverado, a film directed by Lawrence Kasdan, which starred Kevin Kline, Scott Glenn, Danny Glover, and Kevin Costner. The supporting cast was equally impressive: Brian Dennehy, Rosanna Arquette, John Cleese, Jeff Goldblum, and Linda Hunt. The film was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Sound and one for Bruce Broughton's outstanding score. Now, when Bruce Broughton first saw the film, he thought the score could be done simply, thinking about a harmonica and guitar score. But Lawrence Kasdan said he was making a Western for people who had never seen a Western before. With that in mind, Broughton went on to compose a rousing score like the classics that came before it, The Magnificent Seven, The Comancheros, and many others. The score was written in 4 weeks, and in this score, Broughton also brought in some new ideas. First was avoiding the use of any traditional folk songs and breathing new life into Western action music by pumping up the percussion parts, augmenting low brass, and giving the French horns more complex material to play. This sensational score received an expanded treatment 10 years ago by Intrada Records, and it's still available to purchase. So if you don't own this album, then I highly recommend you check out Intrada Records and pick up this amazing classic score. We begin our Bruce Broughton Western scores with his music from 1985's Silverado. music from the original motion picture soundtrack to Silverado with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton, and the original soundtrack recording is available in its complete form on Intrada Records.
Bringing you the very best of original music composed for films, television, and video games. This is Cinematic Sound.
Welcome back to the program. We're featuring music by Bruce Broughton, and more specifically, the music he has written for Westerns. This is our Cinematic Sound in the Spotlight feature. Up next, we're going to feature now music from a 1991 Hallmark Hall of Fame television movie called O Pioneers, which is based on the novel of the same title by Willa Cather. And the film stars Jessica Lange. It tells the story of young Alexandra, who takes over her family's land when her dad dies. She tells her brothers they will stick together and that the farm will grow. We then cut to 20 years later, and we see how the farm has grown. The subplot involves the younger brother, Emile, who falls for a married woman. Tragedy ensues, and the end of the film deals with Alexandra getting together with an old friend. A young Heather Graham actually has a small role in the film. The score is a very Americana-styled score consisting of three main themes. The first theme is almost hymn-like, which represents Alexandra, the main character played by Jessica Lange. There is a rich romantic theme for the character Carl and his relationship with Alexandra, and the third theme goes to Marie, the bohemian girl, and her illicit and doomed love affair with Alexandra's brother. Bruce Broughton's music is beautiful and reflective, and would actually give subtle hints to another Western score that Broughton would work on a few years later. Here now is music from the 1991 Hallmark Hall of Fame television movie, O Pioneers, with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton. Music from the original motion picture soundtrack to O Pioneers, with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton, and the original soundtrack recording is available on Intrada Records.
Bringing you the very best of original music composed for films, television, and video games, this is Cinematic Sound.
Welcome back to the program, and in the spotlight this week, we're featuring Bruce Broughton Westerns. Up next is music from the 1993 classic Tombstone, which is my second favorite of the Wyatt Earp pictures that came out around the same time. The other was titled Wyatt Earp, which starred Kevin Costner and was directed by Lawrence Kasdan and featured a fantastic original score by James Newton Howard. And that one just slightly beats out this film, but both casts are absolutely incredible. Tombstone, however, is a highly entertaining, far more action-packed film that was directed by George P. Cosmatos and was written by Kevin Jarre, who was also the original director, but was replaced early on in production. The film stars Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer. Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday is amazing in this movie. The film also stars Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton, Powers Booth, Michael Biehn, and Dana Delaney in supporting roles, as well as narration by Robert Mitchum. The music to Tombstone is not particularly Western in that the orchestration depends not at all on typical Western instrumentation such as guitar or harmonica. It relies on instruments of ethnic color like the Hungarian cymbalum, Irish whistle, just to name a few. The brass section includes, along with tenor and bass trombone, the more massive contrabass trombone. The themes in the score include one for the Outlaw Cowboys, heard at the top of the album, which is a motif containing metal percussion, low strings, and contrabass sousaphone. There's also a brothers theme, a family theme, which is heard following the main title of the picture, and it's not really heard again until the end of the film, and Josephine, Wyatt Earp's love interest, gets a lyrical theme as well. The score is a classic and features one of the greatest end credit cues you will ever hear. And now, I'm very pleased to present music from the 1993 film Tombstone, with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton and performed by the Sinfonia of London Orchestra.
This is the Cinematic Sound Radio Spotlight.
Welcome back to Cinematic Sound Radio. This is the show dedicated to the music of film, television, and video games. My name's Eric Woods, and I'm your host. In the Spotlight this week, we're listening to Bruce Broughton Westerns. We have 4 more Westerns to play for you, and the first one is from the 1997 CBS miniseries called True Women, based on the 1993 novel by Janice Woods Windell, starring Dana Delaney, Annabeth Gish, Angelina Jolie, Julie Carmen, and Rachel Lee Cook. The series covered 5 decades from the Texas Revolution through Native American uprisings and the Civil War to the early stages of the women's suffrage movement. The miniseries was first aired on CBS television over 2 nights in May of 1997. The original score was composed by Bruce Broughton, and it's an expansive score, a lot larger than you would think that would be associated with the TV film, especially in the 1990s. With that being said, Broughton brought his score to London to be performed by the magnificent Symphonia of London Orchestra, who had worked on such scores as Batman and The Mummy Returns, as well as Bruce Broughton's own Tombstone. There are themes aplenty in this score, including a noble and expansive main theme, which serves as an emotional underpinning to the great pride and deeds of the brave Texas women in the film. There are also several character themes, one for the sisters. There's a love theme, a terrifying Indian warrior theme, as well as several other motifs. If you love melodic, expansive, dramatic scores, then this one is for you. This is a hidden gem, folks. It's from the 1997 television miniseries True Women, with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton and performed by the Symphonia of London Orchestra. music from the original motion picture soundtrack to True Women, a 1997 television miniseries with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton and performed by the Symphony of London Orchestra, and the original soundtrack recording is available on Intrada Records.
You're listening to Cinematic Sound with your host, Eric Woods.
Welcome back to Cinematic Sound Radio, and in the spotlight this week we are featuring the Western scores composed by Bruce Broughton. I really hope you're enjoying today's program. Up next, we're going to listen to music from a 2001 television movie called The Ballad of Lucy Whipple, which tells the story of the adventures of a family who head west to the California gold fields of the 1850s. Now, for this score, Bruce Broughton basically takes the Western genre back to its bare roots, mostly emphasizing only those instruments that would have been heard in the rough 1850 towns. The live ensemble consists of a fiddle, cello, tin whistle, acoustic guitar, percussion, and a baritone horn. The score, as Broughton says it in the liner notes, is stark, sentimental, thoughtful, lighthearted, tragic, aggressive, and very, very simple. Here now is music from the 2001 television movie, The Ballad of Lucy Whipple, with original score composed by Bruce Broughton. Music from the television movie The Ballad of Lucy Whipple, released in 2001, with original score composed by Bruce Broughton. And the original soundtrack recording was released on Entrada Records, but as I check right now, the album is currently sold out. So the best way for you to pick this one up, if you like what you heard, is to find it somewhere online, Amazon, eBay, wherever. Hopefully you can find it, because it's a really, really lovely score.
You're listening to the film, television, and video game music radio show, Cinematic Sound.
Welcome back to Cinematic Sound Radio. Today we're featuring Bruce Broughton Westerns, and up next is music from the Hallmark Entertainment 2002 film Roughing It. This film tells the story of a teenaged Mark Twain who travels to the American West during the Gold Rush days in search of fortune and his destiny. The film is based on Mark Twain's novel and was directed by Charles Martin Smith and stars Robin Dunn and James Garner. The score, like all of Broughton's other Western scores, is lyrical. It's just brimming with melody throughout. This score also has some warmth to it, a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, some jaunty, fun, whimsical writing, along with some action, suspense, romance, and sweep. It's a lovely score, which was recorded in London by the London Symphonia Orchestra. And now music from the 2002 film Roughing It, with original score composed and conducted by Bruce Broughton. music from the original motion picture soundtrack to Roughing It, a 2002 Hallmark Entertainment film, with original score composed by Bruce Broughton, featuring the Symphonia of London Orchestra, and the original soundtrack recording was released by Intrada Records.
You're listening to Cinematic Sound with your host, Eric Woods.
Well, we've sadly come to the end of yet another edition of Cinematic Sound Radio, right here on Rock On Radio, WROCK Radio at WROCKradio.com. Again, thanks to everyone at WROCK for helping me get this show on the WROCK airwaves. And we're now part of the Pod Tyrant network of podcasts, and thanks to everyone at Pod Tyrant for all of their support. Feel free to reach out to Cinematic Sound Radio by emailing me at cinematicsound@yahoo.com. Don't forget to visit cinematicsound.net to hear an archived version of this show and years of previous programming as well. We're also on iTunes. And if you have a request or album that you'd like to hear, please email me at cinematicsound@yahoo.com. I also want to thank Tim Burton for lending his voice and composer David Cosina for writing Cinematic Sound Radio's intro music. The last score you're going to hear on this program comes from an 8-part miniseries that aired on History Channel called Texas Rising, starring Bill Paxton, Brendan Fraser, Ray Liotta, among others. There's so many stars in this television movie. And the series basically covers the events of the Texas Revolution of the 1830s. Now, for this film, John Debney and Bruce Broughton basically teamed up. And what we don't know is whether the two composers worked separately or worked together. Each cue on the album is attributed to both composers equally. We're not sure who's responsible for what theme, what cue, this and that. So it's really, when you listen to it, it's a genuine mixture of styles, and it all is very, very cohesive. So that's probably the reason why they both get credit equally on the album and in the film. But that doesn't really matter because the score is absolutely outstanding. And it's great to hear music of this sort, especially from the pen of Broughton. It's a score that we really haven't heard since his last electric score that he wrote for Lost in Space. The score by Debney and Broughton is anchored by an incredible main theme, which goes through a variety of different arrangements in the score. And there is a massive 8-minute battle cue that is among some of the best action music written for the genre. It's the sort of complex melodic action writing you rarely get to hear much from in Hollywood blockbusters, so I'm glad it's welcome on the small screen. And what we're going to feature for you at the end of this suite is a lengthy 9-minute suite that actually opens the album, what we're going to close the show with. And it's just a wonderful highlight package of all the thematic material that is written for this 8-part miniseries. The miniseries aired last year, and I'm ashamed that I actually haven't seen it. One, it was directed by Roland Joffe, so I have to see it. And two, that I didn't recognize this score in my Best of 2015 list last year. It's such a shame because this score is absolutely spectacular. The original soundtrack recording, you can find it on MCA Nashville Records. And now, to end off today's program, music from the 8-part miniseries that aired on History Channel in May of 2015. This is Texas Rising, with original score composed by John Debney and Bruce Broughton. I really hope you enjoyed our spotlight of the Bruce Broughton Westerns. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.